Okay, welcome everyone to our book forum at the Graduate Center for Worker Education, City University of New York. We have an esteemed guest tonight, Randy Shaw, who's the author of a very important book, Beyond the Fields. Just came out in paperback, and we'd like to celebrate its release. Randy is the director of the San Francisco Housing Clinic, the Tenderloin Housing Clinic to be specific. And he is the editor of the Daily Coast, which is an online newspaper that provides...
Beyond Cron.
Forgive me, did I say Beyond
Yes.
Cron? We'll start all over again. He's the editor of Beyond Cron, C-H-R-O-N, which is an alternative San Francisco daily online newspaper, which provides the real news as opposed to the Chronicle. I wish we had the equivalent here in New York City to provide the real news as opposed to the New York Times. Anyway, I give you Randy Shaw. Thank you for making it here.
Thank you, Penny. And thank the Graduate Center for having me. I do want to say, people often ask me, how come you wrote this book about the legacy of the farm workers movement? I assume you worked for the UFW, and I always have to say, well, no, I never did. And how I ended up getting connected to the UFW explains something I think about one of the major themes of the book, which is how the farm workers became this great incubator and how they did very creative ways to build social movements that have then been replicated today in the last 40 years and actually still need to be replicated more. And maybe our biggest challenge as progressives to come up with similar incubators and the like. So I got connected to the farm workers. My wife here, who's in the front row, was on the list of people who would be contacted by UFW volunteers in Berkeley in the 70s. And through her, I got to know someone named Gary Guthman. And I got to hear Gary's story. And Gary is a guy who grew up in Los Angeles, near where I grew up, went off to Maine for college, decided to take a year off in between after his second year, was walking through Sproul Plaza in the Berkeley campus and saw a table, a UFW table, because in those days you couldn't go to any college campus. The farm workers were the first union to actually recruit off college campuses. And he saw a table, and invariably there'd be a table, and sign up, and they'd say, could you sign up and try to help us? And people say, sure, look at the literature, I'll sign up, try to help you. And most of us, whenever we've signed anything up, we've signed and never hear from people again. But what many didn't know was the farm workers under Fred Ross, who trained Cesar Chavez, their staff was trained that anyone who signed up, you called them that night. Because Fred realized that if you call them that night, it's like you have a live person, and they'll feel they just signed up, they should follow through their commitment. So Gary's home that night, and they call him up, and they say, hey, we met you at Sproul, you signed up, could you come down to Telegraph Avenue and help us tomorrow at a table? And Gary figures, well, okay, well, I'm down here anyway, sure. So he goes down to Telegraph, and he's sitting there while what they called it barking, where you sort of, instead of the passive where you sit at a table and just, wait for people to stop, you're actually out there saying, hey, come on, help the cause here, really, we need your help, please, come on down here. And so, then Gary's watching this, and they say to Gary, well, why don't you do that? I guess he figures, he's there anyway. So Gary spends about an hour barking, and then he goes home, and they're all grateful, and he thinks, okay, I've done my thing, and I'll go on my life. Well, he gets a phone call that night, and the UFW volunteer says, Gary, you've done a lot for us, we really appreciate it, but Cesar Chavez is speaking at St. Joseph the Worker Church down on 10th Street, and he really needs someone to provide security. Now, I always say, well, if Cesar, you just think, someone wants you to provide security for the famous Cesar Chavez, who's going to say no? So Gary says, sure, and he's down there on a cold night in Berkeley, walking along, just providing security, and all of a sudden, a guy comes up to him and says, hey, I'm Cesar Chavez, thanks a lot for helping. Well, Gary Guthman decides, you know what, I'm going to go join the farm workers. I'm going to become, a UFW volunteer, and that's how I met him through my wife, where he'd frequently show up, and I describe in the book how the farm workers trained people to sort of live off the land. And so Gary would inevitably arrive at my wife's place about 5 o'clock, and we'd start talking and everything, and then, and she'd be making dinner, And then it was like dinner was over, and Gary was still there. So logically, we would say, "Gee, Gary, would you like to stay for dinner?" And he's, "Sure, thank you, great." Because, you know, people know the salary was $5 a week plus room and board. Not like you're going to go out for a lot of meals. So that's how I got to, through Gary, I got to know the farm workers, you know, be connected to the farm workers movement. And then what happened in the late 1970s, Gary, along with others, Bill Gramfield was here today, and Kevin O'Connor, a number of other people, they left the farm workers and they went to join Local 2, which was then HERE, it's now Unite here in San Francisco. And I stayed in touch with Gary. We played basketball together, and Gary was actually living in the same house with a man named Miguel Contreras, who's a major figure in my book, who went on to head the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor and a very influential person really in modern political history and Latino empowerment. But the point being is that people got their start because there was a person at Sprout Cloud, there was an organization that was saying, we want to recruit activists, and we want to give activists something meaningful to do with their lives. And we want to create a social movement. And if you look at the 1960s labor movement, that was not happening. You did not see other unions trying to recruit on campuses, trying to recruit folks. And also, as I describe it in the book, other labor unions wouldn't have had much success because labor at that time was seen as the establishment. George Meany, who headed the AFL-CIO, was a big backer of the Vietnam War. UFW was against the Vietnam War. A number of big political causes. So if you were had a new left sensibility, you would never have said, I'm going to go work for the AFL-CIO. You would say, I want to be with the farm workers movement because they were like the counterculture of its time. But the key thing, again, which is really one of the major themes, I think, of the book and the legacies of the UFW, what I think we all need to take away is that they took the time to A, recruit someone like Gary, and B, to train him, and to turn organizing into a real discipline, as opposed to saying, okay, come join us and hand out flyers on a corner, we're never going to give you any skills, we're never going to give you any training, we just want you to burn you out, so to speak. That wasn't what it was about. It was giving people meaning and power and the skills, which is why they ended up working 100 hours a week for $5 an hour. I also describe in the book a woman named Sharon DeLugich, who is 14 years old, living in Silver Lake in Southern California. And her parents were a little political. They weren't eating grapes or lettuce. But she's 14 years old. She's just 10th grade. And her sister says, hey, if you're going out in the direction of Save-On, would you pick up a highlighter for me? He says, sure, I have no problem. And she gets there, and there's a farm worker at the table. Because often the people, there were tables, every supermarket had a table to educate people about the boycotts. Here there was a farm worker, and he started saying that, gee, this Save-On is selling Gallo wine, and you can't go in there and print it. We don't want you to patronize Save-On. So Sharon was 14 years old. She had a problem, a dilemma. What do I do? My sister's counting on me to pick this highlighter up, but I don't want to, break the boycott of Save-On. So she goes in and steals the highlighter. And then she gets home and tells her mother, I don't think I want to go to school anymore. I want to work full-time for the UFW. And I always am careful who's in the audience when I mention this example, because I don't want to try to encourage saying that parents should let their kids leave school at 14. She did get her high school equivalency, but she turned 15 and she worked full-time as a boycott field captain for the UFW. And Sharon was so good that when they had the 1976 Prop 14 campaign, they flew her up to Oakland to be involved in that. They wanted her to be a team captain in charge of 22 other people. There was only one problem. She couldn't be a team captain because she wasn't old enough to drive. And the team captains had to drive people, and she wasn't 16. But both Sharon and Gary are people who may have dedicated their lives to social justice had they never met the UFW. It's possible. But the fact is that both have spent their entire lives working for social justice after that initial contact with the UFW. I mentioned how a lot of new left folks didn't feel comfortable working with mainstream labor. You often forget that back in the 60s, if you were a woman and you wanted to work in a male-dominated union, there were no jobs. Male-dominated unions did not hire women organizers. So you've heard of Dolores Huerta, of course, who became very famous and famous this day, but people like Jessica Govea, who at age 4 is picking crops with her parents, age 4, she became a farm worker, and at 19, they send her up to Toronto with her then boyfriend Marshall Gans and with Miguel Contreras, and she did very well there, and they say, okay, Jessica, you've done so well, you're going to be in charge of our Montreal boycott. Now, the way things work at the UFW, when they said you're going to be in charge of the Montreal boycott, it wasn't like it probably is now in labor, where that means, okay, we've got a team up there, you're going to be coordinating a bunch of folks, we've got an office, we've got a staff, and we've got a budget. Because under Cesar Chavez is kind of living off the land philosophy, it was up to Jessica to get there and recruit a staff, find office space, and get donations to run her operation. So they send a 19-year-old woman whose first language is Spanish to a province whose first language is French, and they basically say, organize it. And I describe in the book, she did. She did, and Jessica Govea became one of the great organizers in this country. Again, because she was given an opportunity that would not have been available. Miguel Contreras, and how many people here have heard of Miguel Contreras? Because that's good. Because here's a guy, in writing this book, I realized just what an incredibly great figure. Unfortunately, he died in 2005, very young. So he doesn't, if he were around now, I think more people would hear of him. But Miguel Contreras is also a farm worker. He goes up to Toronto, and it's cold up there. Because remember, these folks growing up in the Central Valley of California, they're used to warm weather. They don't really have winter like we know it here in the East Coast or the Midwest or in Canada. So he doesn't have any money because they're not getting any budget or anything from the farm workers. So how does he figure out how to stay warm? Well, he goes to in the course of going to each religious order, requesting the support of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, he made it appear as if he was going to join those orders. And so they'd say to him, well, take a coat. You must be cold. So he'd have all these coats and these people bringing him food because he gave them all the impression he was going to join their order. That kind of creativity served him well in his entire life. And I describe in the book in a major way about all the incredible things, how he took the UFW's lessons and succeeded with them. Eliseo Medina was another guy who's a farm worker who has said a few years ago that if not for the UFW, he probably would have ended up a foreman on a ranch, 8th grade education, walks into the union hall one day because he's got a bad leg, he can't pick crops, says, anything for me to do? And Dolores Huerta says, well, we have this election coming up at the farm, and Fred Ross is kind of training people on how to win the union elections. And, if you're interested, you might want to show up. So Eliseo's got nothing else to do because he can't work. Sure, he shows up, and they win that election. He decides, I kind of like being an organizer. So Cesar says, great, we think you have a lot of skills. We're going to send you out to Chicago to head our Midwest boycott. And Eliseo says, great, what bus do I take? He thought Chicago was just like up to somewhere in California. And I have a whole chapter how they sent Eliseo to Florida in a campaign against agribusiness. And all over the country they're passing these anti-farm worker laws. And Eliseo gets there, he's 22 years old, and all of Florida labor says it's hopeless, you can't defeat agribusiness, best to compromise. And Eliseo says, you don't understand, I'm from the UFW, we don't compromise. And he ends up, how I describe in the book, having the agribusiness in Florida begging for mercy. Yet all of those people are people who, had there not been an institution like the UFW, they wouldn't have been in the labor movement. Not to mention have entire careers in organizing.